What now, Dr. Morbius? Prepare your minds for a new scale of physical scientific values, gentlemen.
The deeper a thing is, the more interesting.
Anti-gravity.
Most physicists don't know the story.
We still don't know much more about this in the white world.
I've never heard of it.
The more I ask why,
It's probably classified physics.
it gets interesting.
The role of aerospace companies as holders of potentially basic scientific knowledge not shared with the academic world. Is it possible?
May be wrong, but it's true.
It's the bit of electrodynamics you're not allowed to know.
It is true. You believe it's true.
Yeah, I know it's true.
Disruption is coming.
Most people have very little interest in history. This, however, is going to be a history lesson, quite unlike anything that anyone has ever heard. It certainly will be nothing like what we are taught in school.
You could use these transformers to demonstrate lightning like they used in the World's Fair. And this would make people realize where it started. It started with Nikola Tesla. And those are the actual units that were used.
Tesla was right. Every textbook in the U.S. is wrong. Maxwell simply assumed out of thin air the transverse string wave because that's what everybody was familiar with when he wrote the first equations, and it's never been changed to this day.
Tesla basically patented every aspect of our modern electric power system. Every aspect. And these are the patents. And
how did you get hold of them?
I bought them.
And what was your reason for buying them?
To save them.
From?
From being destroyed in the junkyard. I mean, they were going to junk them.
It begins with a name which most people have heard, but probably won't be able to place. The name of E.H. Harriman. Who was E.H. Harriman?
Dynamite's ready, Butch.
Mr. E.H. Harriman himself, he had the confidence of...
Open the door or that's it! You think E.H. Harriman would get himself killed for you? Woodcock?
I worked for Mr. E.H. Harriman on the Union Pacific Railroad, and he entrusted me.
Where do you think all this is headed?
Well, that I think, to be pointed, I think that the UFO issue presents the greatest possible opportunity for unveiling the lengths to which the national security state has gone in taking over the control of the government of the United States. And that they're fascists, you know. That the people who created the Central Intelligence Agency, you know, they're fascists, and they believe that the most effective way of running the government is to deploy the instrumentalities of the state on behalf of the interests of the major corporations.
Now, it's very easy to dismiss all of this as bizarre, silly and irrelevant until you see the list of Skull and Bones members who have ruled America since Skull and Bones began. Although they only graduate 15 initiates a year, those 15 have always gone on to occupy the very highest positions in American society. US Secretary of State William Max Evarts was a Bonesman, as was Treasury Secretary Franklin McVeigh, Chief Justice Simeon Eben Baldwin, and the 27th President of the United States, William Howard Taft. The founder of American football, Walter Camp, came through Skull and Bones, as did the very first chairman of the Federal Reserve, Pierre Jay, and director of Standard Oil, Percy Rockefeller. Averill Harriman, the son of E.H. Harriman and founder of Harriman Brothers, the largest investment bank in the world, was a Bonesman, and so were both of the George Bush presidents.
And what was Brown Brothers Harriman was just like a normal law firm at the surface, or what?
No, Brown Brothers Harriman wasn't a law firm. Brown Brothers Harriman was a collective investment company.
Oh, it was an investment company, that's right.
And they had the richest 25 patrons from the robber barons that were all investors, common investors. And they would come together and decide how they were going to direct their investments together.
I'm sure Americans in particular will be amused to learn that Edward Henry Harriman was actually a real historical figure. This man was one of America's first industrial giants, And like the Rockefellers in oil and the Carnegies in steel, he got his start by borrowing money from the Rothschilds to create a monopoly for his own business, which was railroads. He was the 19th century railroad king, and it helped in turn to create the Rockefeller oil monopoly. And this gave America's first industrial giants colossal power. These were the first people in human history, we mustn't forget, whose businesses were worth more than most countries. People whose fortunes dwarfed anything that the Caesars or the Tudors or the Medici ever dreamed of. So, being greedy, they used this power to engage in price fixing. Naturally, they formed a cartel. Their attitude was that they could charge whatever they liked for steel and oil and transporting goods on the railways. They knew that all American business was dependent on them, and they'd made sure there was no competition. So they could ignore market forces and charge pretty much whatever they liked. Now this naturally caused resentment, and it's very interesting that the press at that time started calling these first Illuminati bankers and industrialists robber barons.
It will provide the world with fuelless energy. It is true, it can be done. It has been done by many inventors, but they never had the whole system. They never had an ability to understand it. Tesla provided that. Well, he can supply the world with fuelless energy. There's no need to burn hydrocarbons. It's useless. It's much better to have, but the problem is that there's no economic advantage in not having to have oil.
Of course, once these fortunes began to be made, others naturally tried to get in on the act. One who succeeded was J.P. Morgan, who became a private banker during this period.
Why do you think people like Morgan hated Tesla so much?
Because Tesla was going to supply the world with fuelless energy. How can Morgan make? How can he make money if you can't put a meter on radio waves? You can't charge for the electricity. I mean, he was so far ahead of his time, but none of them understood what it meant to fight the elimination of fuel. That was what they didn't connect, was that what Tesla was doing was eliminating billions of dollars that were being spent for the, you see, at that time, Edison was going to put a generator every 2 miles on the face of the earth powered by coal, because coal was the thing at that time. It wasn't oil yet. It was before Ford and the use of oil. So imagine the money that was going to be made by digging up all that coal and all the soot that would control. You see, Tesla wrote a paper about the danger of using all of this coal burning. Oh, it goes on and on. It's too much. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. It shows you the power of money, or the power of eliminating the anyway. Tesla was a true humanitarian. I can't go on unless you see the Indians have an expression that you can't understand a man's life until you walk in his moccasins. And that's what I'm talking.
5 years after E.H. Harriman died and handed on the business to his sons, W. Averill Harriman and E. Rowland Harriman, this new breed of Western business moguls faced their first really big test with the coming of World War I. But actually, Western capitalism emerged from World War I in a far stronger state than it was in at the beginning. So how could this be? The First World War taught the new class of international bankers and industrialists a very simple lesson. War is good for business.
They're fucking fascists. It's what they are, you know, and that's what they're into. And they think that it's perfectly appropriate. If they think it's perfectly appropriate to engage in utilizing their military and their intelligence resources to garner privileged access to the strategic raw materials of the planet. What else is there?
Bankers and industrialists on the question of what to do for best with a defeated and dilapidated Germany. The population were poor, penniless and worn out, yet the German economy still contained some of the most sophisticated and expensive industrial stock on the planet. Supposing, as the world's first international businessmen, they could get their hands on Germany's steel mills, her coal mines, her factories, ports, and her shipbuilding industry.
After World War I, this gets a little complicated, but after World War I, in 1918, they had the Versailles Treaty negotiations.
Yeah.
It turns out that the Secretary of State under Wilson, back in 1918, was a guy named Robert Lansing. Robert Lansing was the son-in-law of John W. Foster, who was the former Secretary of State back in 1893. He's the grandfather of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. Those are his nephews. And so what he does is, when he supervises setting up the Versailles Treaty, he brings in his two nephews as part of the team that they bring to Versailles. Those are the two guys that drafted the war reparations provisions inside the Treaty of Versailles. Because what they did is they said, oh, look, we're imposing the war reparations requirements of Germany through the exercise of the power of the State Department, supervising the Versailles Treaty. And so they have this major debt now that they owe to all the corporations that they had destroyed their property in the aggressive war in World War I, right? And so what they did then is, through the power of his office as Secretary of State, Robert Lansing appoints Allen Dulles, who is legal counsel for Brown Brothers Harriman, to be the lawyer for Germany. And he conducts a negotiation pursuant to which those war reparations will be covered by Brown Brothers Harriman.
Dulles and his older brother John Foster Dulles wrote the Treaty of Versailles. They were both lawyers of Sullivan and Cromwell, and it was largely they who decided that the German people must pay war reparations totaling 135 billion marks. A mind-boggling sum at that time, which today translates into 250 trillion.
They're going to extend loans to the German government to pay the war reparations, and they're going to take as security for those loans stock in all their major military industries.
That war was good for business was not the only lesson the ruling classes learned during this period. The Russian Revolution of 1917 terrified rich people all over the world. Watching Lenin and Trotsky taking over such a vast area of the globe, the kings and queens of Europe's tiny sovereign states in particular became extremely nervous. The question on all their minds was, supposing the communist success in Russia should inspire their own working class to rise in revolt.
In 1924, George Herbert Walker leaves Brown Brothers Harriman, sets up the Union Bank of New York, completely capitalized by the guys who were part of Brown Brothers Harriman, all the 25 investors. They capitalized the bank. They set up a foreign subsidiary up in the Netherlands called the Bank of Shipping and Commerce, that's run by Fritz Thyssen, and they finance the construction of the international headquarters of the Third Reich. And they start funneling money to Hitler to rise up to become the bulwark against Bolshevism in Europe. And so that they wanted Hitler to establish this kind of fascist government, the economic theory of which is you place all the instrumentalities of the government at the disposal of the interests of the private corporations, and they will then help help the major corporations. The corporations will prosper. They'll hire more people. It'll stimulate your economy. And people all the way up into the top agreed with that. That's a great idea.
The only issue is
like Henry Ford and the guys at Brown Brothers Harriman. They thought that's a good idea to do that. Right?
I think Ford had ideological sympathies as well.
That was what they were doing. So that's how. And then when Hitler started coming off the leash. And deciding that he was not only going to become the bulwark, he's going to nationalize everything, he's going to take it all over. And so that ended up getting sort of out of control. They lost control of him.
But it's like, this is like a really interesting narrative that the CIA, they're set up by oligopolistic interests. To be able to set up an economic system that was actually fascist. He goes back to Brown Brothers Harriman, where he had, in effect, never really left. Because the Central Intelligence Agency was the brainchild of the people at Brown Brothers Harriman.
Robert Lovett, who was one of the senior partners there, is the one who wrote the original memo to Truman recommending that they create a Central Intelligence Agency and that they have a covert operations capacity, which they put in Section 5412 to authorize them to engage in covert operations.
And it was with these subtle and not so subtle methods that the international elite began to shape our destiny for the remainder of the 20th century.
The intellectuals of the period were furious. They were incensed, they were depressed, and you get a very good feeling of the political atmosphere of the time from the diaries of the Labour politician Harold Nicolson, when he writes, "We have lost our willpower since our willpower is divided. The people of the governing class think only of their own fortunes, which means hatred of the Reds. Our class interests cut across our national interests, and I go to bed in gloom."
Now, what separated the 1860s, which look like antiquity to many of us, from 1952, when we have the first fusion weapon explode? It was changes in our understanding of the physical world.
Well, what brings the development of technology really home to me is my great-grandmother, who's no longer living, but I remember as a boy she would tell me stories of her trip across the United States from the East Coast in a covered wagon. And her first home on the West Texas prairie was a dugout with a sod roof. And she told me stories of the Indian Wars and all kinds of things. And she lived to see the development of the Boeing 707 and all the modern accoutrements of our society today. And I was always dumbstruck by this. I just could not imagine how people who went through that much of a transition in technology in their life could even keep their sanity, much less understand what was happening.
My understanding is that there were really twin loci of activity, one of which surrounds a Gravity Research Foundation in New Boston, New Hampshire, and I guess that was the work of Babson. So Babson contacted Lewis Whitten, who was coming out of Johns Hopkins, and then oddly, the similarly named individual named Bainson, with some sort of tobacco or air conditioning fortune, reaches out to Bryce DeWitt and asks whether he will found an institute at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for the study of physical fields.
And particularly focusing on gravity.
Particularly focused on gravity. Now somehow DeWitt has the courage to answer this essay contest in the other silo and destigmatizes it. So there was money to be had, but nobody wanted to touch it because of fear of ridicule from their colleagues. And then there's a famous gravity conference at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, that sort of kicks a lot of this off. It's a tremendous flurry of activity at a time when anti-gravity was trying to break into respectability. At a minimum, we know that the Glenn Martin Company, where Martin was an early pioneer, I think from the time of the Wright brothers, that the Glenn Martin Company becomes Martin Marietta, later becomes Lockheed Martin, so that word Martin is coming all the way through, was employing, I believe, Lewis Whitten, Edward Whitten's father, to do anti-gravity research, somehow tied up with Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio and the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. So there's something about aerospace in the 1950s and sort of post-Manhattan Project era that's pretty potent.
But of course, those of us who served in the intelligence community, I was in the Office of Naval Intelligence, and you've been connected with the Central Intelligence Agency and the Joint Chiefs. We know that in secret they're at least 50 to 100 years ahead of anything that the public sees as the state of the art of any technology.
No question about it. No question about it.
I mean, it turns out that if you can create a toroidal vortex at 5 times the thermodynamic speed limit. Now, when Shaw came back from the Anahuac Atoll for the study of the hydrogen bomb, he built a 2-mile-long plywood tunnel that was big enough to drive a military truck through. That tunnel was backfilled with helium because helium has an adiabatic constant of 1, and they could measure the shock wave of our first hydrogen bomb. But what they discovered was superluminal velocity. And so the military knew about superluminal velocity in 1948.
They made a whole combination of 3 disks rotating in different directions, And they were able to create the devices that were levitating and propagating in space.
And Shaw's particular job was to study the Mach disk generator, which the Germans had developed as a vortex weapon. It could crush a B-29 like a moth, but unfortunately it didn't get into operation in time, and that was perhaps good for the world.
According to my knowledge, both American part and Russian part got the drawings of German engineers and tried to replicate, but failed. There is a small secret there, and it took me many years to solve this problem.
But what they succeeded in doing, and I was privileged in that I saw some data which is probably super classified, but I saw the film. I mean, they thought I was a child. It didn't matter. I mean, but I certainly remember it.
The point is that the disk should have unbalanced rotation. That means wobbling, if you want. And the speed of the rotation should be big enough because we're working with small disks and small masses. Therefore, we use the rotation of up to 15,000 rotations per minute. And we have a very clear and measurable and observable effect. This is a repulsive force that goes from the disk. So these are torsion fields that the scientists were looking for.
Mach discovered that if you have some, if I could create the right kind of a magnetic field, I could punch a hole in the fabric of time. Wow. That's what I wanted to do.
So later, again, we came to the conclusion that there is no necessity to rotate the disk, but it is possible to rotate only magnetic fields because it gives practically the same picture. We create vortexes in physical vacuum or ether, if you like, and rotating magnetic fields gives much better effect, much stronger effect. And if we speak about a possibility of interstellar travel, definitely rotating heavy masses is not a good approach, but rotating magnetic fields is a key to propellerless propulsion.
Now, you have to understand that the fabric of time is entropy. So all he was talking about was what Prigogine did in 1977 when he won the Nobel Prize. But, and that gets into atomic memory and reversing the vector of time.
Another puzzle we would love to have cleared up is an understanding of the role of aerospace companies as holders of potentially basic scientific knowledge not shared with the academic world. Is it possible? It seems very wrong to me.
Maybe wrong, but it's true.
It is true. You believe it's true.
Yeah, I know it's true.
You know that there's physics knowledge held by aerospace companies that is not known?
There certainly is materials knowledge.
Materials, well, okay, material
which
science.
Which involves topological physics or whatever. I mean.
Okay. But fundamental physics as opposed to, condensed matter or...
Right. Certainly aerospace corporations have knowledge in the UAP area that specifically are sequestered against FOIA.
Oh,
because of proprietary labels, which the whole thing was set up to be that way, on purpose.
Right, but the idea that there would be fundamental physics knowledge that would be housed in an aerospace company and not shared with the physics community, there is no evidence of that.
No evidence for it, not that I know of.
And I wouldn't.
That doesn't mean it's not the case, but.
Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, who was the first director of the CIA States. This is the first CIA director, because he also later found out he was being Schmidt-canned, pushed aside by these neo-fascists who had taken over the intelligence community, the aerospace community, and the large corporations. What happened over those years, from 1947 until 1956, was that there was a deliberate, albeit imperceptible initially, take over by the corporate state.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
In probably the 50s, the author was Talbert, and he did a series where he found out that a number of aerospace engineering companies were suddenly interested in anti-gravity, and that people like DeWitt on up and down, really top-level physicists, were suddenly getting grants to look at the idea of anti-gravity. For example, the gravity essay came along.
This is from the Gravity Research Foundation in Boston.
Right. And so it looked like it was going to be a big explosion. But anyway, then it all sort of quieted down. And I could take two implications of that, and that is it quieted down because nobody ever got anywhere. Or it quieted down because they did get somewhere and it went black.
But there's several references in several books and texts that are not well known to the public that disclosed the existence of a secret space program that even had a director of space and was administered mainly under the Navy, Department of the Navy, through DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And the public, of course, was told that NASA was the only space program when in fact Eisenhower had established this secret space program by executive order in the early 50s.
Yeah, we should mention here that Roswell happens in 47, but it doesn't get reported until 1977 and 78.
Yeah.
And so it's a 30-year gap in the reporting of that story.
Yeah,
except that,
but I'm hearing about it in 1973, 74.
So
from
he
my
has
dad.
he has knowledge of the event.
Yeah, he said basically the project he was involved in, they got briefed on this thing that had crashed in the 40s. That's what I think. Glad you asked that, because now I can tell you what I think. Particularly by the time I finished the research on this book, and this is what I put forth in the book, I do not think Roswell was any kind of extraterrestrial event. What I think Roswell was, 1947, out there in the middle of that New Mexico desert, you had these secret installations, okay? You had the German rocket scientists, you had the American aerospace medicine guys in the new Air Force, or the Army Air Corps, soon to be new Air Force, who really wanted to put man in space. You had these Germans who'd been working on really wanting to put man in space, dating back to the 1920s and the 1910s. Okay, some of these guys knew each other before the war, the Americans and the Germans.
Yes.
So here they are, the guys who can build the craft to get us up there, the guys who can come up with the life support systems to keep them alive, to get them up there and back. They've got tons of money. They're working secretly with no prying eyes. My question to people is, what do you think they were going to do? You're damn right. They built a craft. It was a human crew. And what it was America's first attempt at manned space flight. They shot him up there. They got him into space. They brought him back. And on return, tragically, it crashed. But because they realized they could do it, Roswell was the origin of our secret space program. Because they could get them up there and bring them back, and they knew they could do it again, they realized, oh my God, we have a space program, a manned space program. Now we can go forth with this. And I say that explains the tight secrecy. Tell them it's balloons. Let them think it's Jack Parsons opening a portal. Let them think it's ETs and little grays. Anything but the fact that what we've got is the beginning of our true secret space program, because it was the Cold War. We weren't sure how far the Russians were taking this. But my point is, I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for that. But when you look at the historical when you actually do an honest look at what the U.S. Army Air Corps had been doing and was doing at that time.
Well, certainly if my dad wasn't, and of course neither one of us will probably ever know whether he was directly involved with that state of technology, he certainly had friends that were, specifically Hoyt Vandenberg, who was original director of the CIA, used to be around the house all the time, Jimmy Doolittle, who was definitely connected with the SASA program. He was sent over to Sweden to investigate the ghost rockets, and he had a very heavy involvement in the later years with the saucer program. People have asked me if my dad was involved in anti-gravity research. Of course, I was born in 1942, and we're talking about like 55, which would make me 13 or 14 years old. He certainly wouldn't have told me anything, so I have no knowledge of that. Talking with my mother, he used to make trips to Fort Huachuca, and it seems that Fort Huachuca was the central area for some very classified technology research, possibly having to do with anti-gravity, but that's as far as I can trace it now.
60s or 70s, but it was in the 50s that we actually mastered gravity control.
I still can't believe that that's true.
It would only be if it were the case that in fact we have mastered anti-gravity and they're being built by aerospace corporations, then new physics would have to be involved.
Now what does that mean? Gravity control is the ability to put an electromagnetic field at certain voltages and with certain angular momentum. I don't want to get into a lot of, put you to sleep, I got into the physics of it too far. So that this object becomes massless, weightless, no mass, M-A-S-S. So the mass component, and this has to do with angular momentum and things of this sort, of the subatomic particles, can make this object so light that it has no mass.
Why is an egg shaped the way an egg is shaped? The reason is because the egg always wants to be with the heavy part of the egg down, because that is the nature of gravity. In other words, gravity is greater at the base of the egg than it is at the top of the egg. So the egg always rests on the rounded side that's heavier. Now what do you do to make the egg turn upside down, to make it anti-gravitational? You spin it. Now we have the connection between spin and gravity, and this is the major part of all of the things that I'm doing and all the things that Tesla was doing, and I'd have to get into some technical details to make sense, but they used to make tops for children. You spin the top and it turns upside down. And why don't people question what is doing this? It's physics, it's a law of God. I mean, it's wonderful. But the physics leads you to all these other things, the things that we're talking about, the Tesla technology.
You can go way beyond that, so there are all kinds of toroidal geometries, for example.
I mean, it turns out that if you can create a toroidal vortex.
In the stuff we were working on, the field we would generate was in a toroidal field that would curl.
Well, that's exactly how this was generated. It was essentially in a toroid around the craft.
Oh, okay.
What EGM is intended to do, it's intended to give engineers a tool by which they can understand and modify gravity.
If mass is the result of electromagnetic discourse between particles, then there's every reason to suppose that by interfering with that discourse, you can modify the mass.
We use electromagnetic fields that we apply into interference patterns that generate accelerated reference frames. When we have an acceleration, that acceleration is equivalent to gravity, just because of the equivalence principle in the same sense. So what we engineer with EGM is, by similarity, equivalent to a gravitational field.
Everything in nature has a point, has a frequency that if you rattle it, it'll break. And there's no absolute reason with that experimental proof why the space-time manifold shouldn't be like that too, perhaps. If the space-time manifold does have a naturally weak point, a point of natural weakness, natural resonance, that you can rattle, I don't know what you'll find.
If I could create the right kind of a magnetic field, I could punch a hole in the fabric of time. Wow.
That would be this crazy egregious
It would change
thing.
our entire concept of who we are if somebody kept fundamental physics secret in the years since we became capable of exploding fusion devices.
Corporations working with unacknowledged special access projects, which are completely off the radar, not funded officially, took over operations. And as a result of that, those national security programs increasingly became out of reach for the president, out of reach for members of Congress, or even cabinet level people like CIA directors and secretaries of state and people of this sort. So this was a gradual thing that happened, but there was an abrupt change by '56. By 1961, when Eisenhower left office, frankly, we were done. It was done.
Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
Because basically what they concluded was they needed to do a few things. They wanted to be able to set up a deception around the subject and put out false information, use it as a cover story for classified aerospace research. So oftentimes there will be something that happens and it will look like a UFO, and it's actually a Northrop Grumman.
It's a scam. That's what I can tell you. What they call UFOs, these craft that fly around the sky, are real. But they're not piloted by some little green guy from some other planet. The technology is real. It's been kept secret, and it's been used to promote this concept that there's an alien threat to this Earth.
I've heard many stories.
Well, I used to think that they were real. As you well know, I saw documents when I was in the Office of Naval Intelligence that said they were real.
And it's possible that they are, but there's also stories of people who have been abducted who have caught their supposed aliens taking off masks or helmets and
turning into military personnel. Yes, I've also run into those people also. And I've looked into the possibility that this whole thing is a tremendous mind control operation in order to convince the public of the world, the mass consciousness of humanity, that the Earth is being threatened by some other species from some other planet, which Ronald Reagan stated in 6 of his speeches during his administration, which is way too many times for me to believe that it was real. It's more like just putting it into people's minds.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
I think that I was intentionally shown documents when I was in the Office of Naval Intelligence that convinced me that extraterrestrials were real. And I really believed that. And when I first came public, I told everybody what I saw in those documents. And I told them I didn't really know the reality of it, but that's what the documents said. And I had no reason to question those documents. But John, when I first really began doing real research and quit believing what I saw and what people told me and really started digging into it, the first thing that I found when I did a computer search of documents in a library for anything about extraterrestrials or other species from other planets or anything like that, it popped out a document from 1917, which was the text of a speech given by John Dewey to the Japanese imperial delegation headed by Viscount Sheehan in New York City. And the first thing out of his mouth, the first sentence in the speech was, and I printed this in the appendix of my book, was, quote, "Someone once told me that the best way to unite all humanity in a one-world government and do away with wars forever is if we were attacked by some other species from some other planet," unquote. And that was like somebody hit me between the eyes with a sledgehammer. And I felt that all through my body. I was just shaken to the core. And here I was looking at the evidence that somebody had thought of doing this as far back as 1917. And I knew instantly that they had the technology to make us all believe it if they wanted to. And then I began going back and looking at, when did all this start? Why, John, it started the minute that President Truman signed the United Nations Treaty and the Senate passed and Truman signed the UN Participation Act. And the first man who reported flying saucers was an ex-intelligence officer flying in a plane up in Washington who saw, or says he saw, 9 disc-shaped craft come out of Canada and then go back in the same direction. And he described them as inverted saucers. And of course the press picked this up and called it flying saucers.
Or Lockheed Martin Skunk Works or some other aerospace entity, and it will be 100% man-made, and the public will say, oh my God, it's a UFO. And they'll not correct them. There's no correction forthcoming. They want you to believe it's a UFO. Why? Because it provides a cover for classified research with technologies that, if they were allowed to come out, would terminate the oil and gas and coal industry. They're using zero-point energy and gravity control.
So an approach that people have looked at really since the early 50s, which is a zero-emission approach to generating energy, is fusion. And in fusion, what's depicted here is really the simplest fusion reaction to achieve. And so what you do is you bring together 2 isotopes of hydrogen, deuterium and tritium. And so when you bring those together with sufficient energy and for a long enough time and a small enough volume, they fuse together, creating helium, a neutron, and a whole bunch of energy that you can harvest with an old-fashioned heat energy cycle. So, it's you can generate energy with the heat. So in addition to being zero emission, fusion has a lot of other benefits. Its energy density is 6 orders of magnitude greater than oil, and the fuel is very low cost and quite plentiful. Deuterium comes from seawater. You can buy bottles of it on the internet for a few $100. And lithium that would be used to breed the tritium is also really very plentiful. And this fuel, there's no proliferation issues, so you can't make a bomb out of this material. And there's no meltdown risk. So you take away the input energy to the fusion reaction, and the reaction stops immediately. And there's very, very little long-lived radioactive waste. So, because of the promise, there's been really since the early 50s, lots of work on developing different fusion concepts.
They have EVOs, is what they've got.
They have EVOs and they don't know they have EVOs?
They won't admit they've got it.
What's the positive things that can be used for?
You name something you want that's good, and it'd probably be the thing that does it for you. It's an energy source. It's just incredible. We can forget all of our energy problems. We forget all of our propulsion problems. Propulsion properties are just incredible. We'll be able to push anything you want, anywhere you want. A form of transmutation, if you want to look at it that way, is a form of teleportation of sorts, because it can take an entity and put the entity over there. It's superluminal, it looks like. Things go faster than light. We're not bound by that rule anymore. It enshrouds stuff. When it enshrouds things, it can allow them to disappear. It does make atoms disappear in laboratory work. Well, that's interesting, because when they disappear, I can transport all this stuff through somewhere else, and it reappears. That's teleportation. So it does that very nicely.
Just a quick question on going back to your third encounter. Do you remember what the craft looked like or how far away it was? Did you get any good impressions of its shape and description?
I didn't. I didn't, because as soon as it turned off the beam that was on me, that first, what I'll call plasma ball, enveloped whatever it was. That plasma ball wasn't there while it was sending the beam down on me. And the beam was like not next to me and not over there somewhere where I saw it. It was on me directly, which was kind of freaky. And it obviously was watching me. It was very aware of me. And when I looked up and consciously recognized where it was coming from and realized that's a UAP, that's when the beam went off and the first plasma ball happened. And it's like it's staged up. I would call it like 3 quantum levels of energy. The first one was, so big, then it more than doubled in size, and then it quadrupled in size, this huge plasma energy ball. And then it just went. And it didn't slowly accelerate. The whole thing, the plasma ball basically was no longer visible as I started to detect the first movement. So whether it just kind of winked out and my perception was that it started a little bit headed west before it disappeared, I cannot really discern. It was just one of those bizarre things that happened so fast. And why it happened, who knows? Maybe George Knapp is right.
They're tracking you. What about the color of the plasma ball? Do you remember?
White.
Same color as the light? Okay, white.
Obviously, these hearings have been about issues much more profound than who did what or knew what in the Iran-Contra affair. They have presented two visions of government, much as the Constitutional Convention was presented with different views of the relationship between government and its citizens 200 years ago. One vision was described in the testimony of Admiral Poindexter, Lieutenant Colonel North, General Secord, and Mr. Hakim, that of a secret government directed principally by NSC staffers, accountable to not a single elected official, including apparently the President himself. A shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself. It is an elitist vision of government that trusts no one, not the people, not the Congress, and not the cabinet. It is a vision of a government operated by persons convinced they have a monopoly on truth. Albert Hakim, a businessman who admitted he was in it for the money, could boast to us that he was more competent to manage the Iran initiative than the Secretary of State. Richard Secord could tell us he was more capable of running intelligence activities than the CIA. Oliver North could describe with enthusiasm Director Casey's plan for a private off-the-shelf organization that would conduct covert operations forbidden to the CIA with funds generated from the sale of U.S. arms. John Poindexter could say that this all sounded like a good idea, maintained that Congress had no meaningful role in foreign policy, and act secure in the belief that the President would have approved the diversion of funds. I believe these hearings will be remembered longest, not for the facts they elicited, but for the extraordinary and extraordinarily frightening views of government they exposed.
When can you start being good? When can you start being wise in any given moment?
I think you're
in
making
history?
an assumption that there's a motivation amongst the people who are decision makers that doesn't exist. I think you're thinking that they're thinking, now who can we collaborate with and then who shares our values, when I don't think that's their intention at all. Now, they may have a PR firm that they hire who says what their intentions are, but I think their intentions are resource extraction, making sure we have a footprint in the region here, there, and the other. I mean, I don't think that these benign ideas that you're talking about are actually being debated very much in the halls of power. And I've been there. I've been at some of these debates where part of what we talk about is, okay, who's going to use whose spare parts in their military so that we can sell spare parts. I think your idea that they have these discussions about international morality at the highest levels is only for public consumption. I don't think they do.
Vigilance abroad does not require us to abandon our ideals or rule of law at home. On the contrary, Without our principles and without our ideals, we have little that is special or worthy to defend.
Before I get to Harvard College, I'm in Special Forces, right, for 2 years, right, in the 5th Special Forces. And I'm out at Fort Devens. We're getting set to do the halo jump, you know, the high altitude. Yeah. We're getting set to do the halo jump. And they bring the Spec 4 from 5th Army Special Forces. And he's sitting there telling us, look, okay, now you gotta remember now, you know, when you jump into the night, you know, you're up at like 38,000 feet, you jump out, you know, you time your drop. And he said, when you drop in, he said, you got to make sure anybody who sees you come in, you got to kill them immediately and bury them with your chute. Because they were trained us to drop in behind the lines in Vietnam, right? And he said, and I said to him, I'm standing there with our unit, and I say, well, wait a second, what if it's women or children? Kill them, he said, and bury them with your chute. We're the fucking Russians, I said. That's exactly what Uncle Jim was hypothesizing, of them jumping into our fucking neighborhood, right? And here we are going 8,000 miles away, jumping into the neighborhood of people that have been there for 5,000 years.
History records that almost 200 years ago, in September of 1787, as the Constitutional Convention was finishing its business, a bystander asked Benjamin Franklin, well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy? And Dr. Franklin replied, a republic, if you can keep it.
When I first started my crusade, I guess that's what you can call it, to try to wake people up, I had a tremendous faith in the American people that all that had to happen was for someone to open their eyes and show them that the normal everyday world that they live in is really a fantasy land, and then they would sort of take it from there, and it's not happening. A lot of people are wakening up. I have to give those people credit because back in 1988, 1987, when I first was looking around, in 1988 when I first came public with what I knew, sometimes I would travel 1,000 miles to sit in a living room and talk to 3 people, if I could find 3 people that wanted to sit in the living room and listen to what I had to say. And now, when I go to a city, sometimes I can fill places as large as the Salt Dome with people who are interested in wanting to know what's happening. But when you consider how many people are there and how many people in the city aren't interested and don't want to know, then it doesn't look like such a big accomplishment. Do you think we're going to wake up this country? Do you think we're going to affect any kind of a change at all?
I don't think so, Bill, but, you know, I applaud the people who go out there and try. I don't try anymore because I've found that people are satisfied with the information that they receive reading the paper in the morning, listening to Dan Rather on the news at 5 o'clock, and then watching Wheel of Fortune at 7:30. And most people are satisfied that they get about all they need to know from that kind of information. It's discouraging because there's some great human beings that would like to make a change, but I just have to say that I am not an optimist at this point.
Well, I'm slowly getting to that not an optimist point also, but I have to keep trying. Every time I look at my little daughter, I can't stop trying to make this a better world because I know that if I fail, she's going to be somebody's property. And that's what's coming. I'm convinced of it.
I'm talking about the real owners now. The real owners, the big wealthy business interests that control things and make all the important decisions. Forget the politicians. The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you. They own everything. They own all the important land. They own and control the corporations. They've long since bought and paid for the Senate, the Congress, the state houses, the city halls. They got the judges in their back pockets. And they own all the big media companies, so they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls. They spend billions of dollars every year lobbying to get what they want. Well, we know what they want. They want more for themselves and less for everybody else. But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest. That's right. It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
And I'm sitting here being told at Fort Devens, you know, in Special Forces, that you jump in and you kill the women and children if you have to and bury them with your chute. And I turned around right then and I walked right out of the place. Turned around, walked away, and Captain Campbell, our commander, said, "Sheehan, where the f*** do you think you're going?" I turned around, I said, "Don't look it. Somebody around here is fucking nuts," I said, "and it ain't me." And I turned around and walked out and never went back. You know, they freaked out and drafted me and you know, all that shit. And I ended up going to Harvard College. Fuck you, I said. I go to Harvard College and I studied American foreign policy under Henry Kissinger. I studied all about the Vietnam War. You know, I got to be one of the point briefers from Harvard Law School to the United States Senate, briefing them on the Cooper Church Amendment as to how they could constitutionally cut off all the funds for the Vietnam War. Right? And I ended up being the lawyer for the Pentagon Papers case to reveal all of this so we could stop the fucking war. Right? And so I took this personally. You know, this is a violation of everything that we've been taught. You know, what these people are doing is a violation of everything that we've been taught. They are the bad guys. They are the bad guys. And there are decent guys that go into the military because, you know, they need a job or they need training stuff, and they get tasked to do all this stuff. And by the time they get buried into this military culture, you know, all they're doing is blindly doing whatever it is they're told. You know, and they invade places and kill people, you know, and then they end up justifying killing somebody because they killed my buddy, you know, and here you are 8,000 miles away. What are we doing invading the Middle Eastern oil fields? It's just completely obvious. We invaded the Middle Eastern oil fields based on a complete, absolute fabricated lie that Saddam Hussein was in possession of nuclear weapons, and we go ho-hum. Oh, well, okay, I guess that was a big fat lie. We've been in and killed tens of thousands of people, you know, spent, you know, hundreds and hundreds of lives of American men and women, you know, for what? To occupy the Middle Eastern oil fields. Why? So that we could control the Middle Eastern oil for our country and keep China from getting it. Okay?
Right.
So, I mean, that's what's happening here, you know? So that's the answer to your question. What do you think about all this national security state?
Right.
I think the national security state is fascist. I think that they are devoted to the proposition that the entire instrumentalities of the state should be put at the disposal of the private interests of corporations, you know, and that is fascism. That's exactly what Mussolini wrote his major essay about on fascism. You know, that is exactly what the idea of fascism is. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's what they're doing. And they're justifying aggressive wars, you know, to go get the resources because somebody else will do it. And they keep on buffaloing everybody that the Soviet Union was planning on taking over the world. You know, that's our job. As George Carlin used to say, you know, that's our job, you know, and that's what they're doing. They're attempting to establish full spectrum dominance over the planet through 800 military bases, through over $1 trillion a year now, $1 trillion a year in major military operations, you know, with young men and women of complete good faith that are Americans that have been raised believing in the fundamental rights of the Constitution and liberty and democracy and all that stuff, and they're being deployed to go kill people, you know, over oil. You know, that is so that Donald Trump and the guys can say, we are the #1 producers of energy now in the world. We are producing more oil than Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
You know, and they're our allies, Saudi Arabia, you know. So it's, you know, that's what I think.
The owners of this country know the truth. It's called the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it.
So it's all about courage. You have the courage to take on this sort of Fourth Reich that's really running these projects, this neo-fascist transnational security state.
I'm for advancing for social benefit, for the good of mankind.
Who you can't talk to about this?
I can't talk to, but I have to advance them, or I don't have any goal to reach. I have to include mankind as my beneficiary. That's all there is.